All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending this session. Our speaker today is Dr. Andrew Jacobson from Catawba College. We've had a bit of a chat ahead of time, and I want you to please feel free to enter your questions into the chat box. But if you have any questions of misunderstanding, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Dr. Jacobson. But at the end, there will be about a 5-minute period for questions and answers, which if you type your question into the chat box, I'll gather them all and read them out at the end. For continuing education credit, please make sure your name is correct on your Zoom login. Also, this session is being recorded and will be available after the conference on the website. So with that being said, Dr. Andrew Jacobson is a conservation biologist who uses GIS and remote sensing in his research. He works at Catawba College, where he coordinates the Geographic Information Systems and Technology minor, teaches classes in GIS, GPS, and UAVs. Dr. Jacobson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Saskia, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in. I'm sorry I can't see your faces. I'm sorry we can't be here in person together. This is my first time at NCAUG. I'm kind of a second-year professor here at Catawba College. So we're just kicking off the GIST minor. We had just our first few graduates this past May, but very much kind of looking to get the ball rolling and get more students involved and more kind of graduates out there in the workforce. So, but this is my first time being here as well. I'm happy to be here and happy to be speaking with you all today. This may be a, yeah, so without any further ado, I'll jump right in. So this presentation largely came out of a publication that came out earlier this year in the journal Global Change Biology. It was part of my postdoctoral work with the National Geographic Society. We had, as you can see, a number of different authors representing a number of different institutions who were involved. So we had people from National Geographic Society, the Nature Conservancy, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, along with a handful of kind of independent researchers and scientists who all helped out in this event, or in this article. So much thanks go to all those individuals and institutions. So to save Earth and humanity, more of Earth needs to be protected. And the approach to increase protection must be smart, it must be swift and targeted in order to, as humanity's impact on the planet keeps expanding and we have limited resources. So we need to prioritize what areas are protected, and we need data to guide those decisions. In this case, the data are maps, and hopefully all of you are map nerds like me. And so we need maps in order to help of human impact across the planet to help us make these decisions. We need to know where humans are, what areas we are affecting, and how intense the impacts are. And this was the primary aim of our research. An equally important but secondary aim was to quantify amount. How much of the world is still left in a relatively wild or intact state? Relatively unimpacted by people. Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Is it 80%? We need to be able to know amount in order to be able to track changes and measure progress over time. And perhaps most importantly, we need to know amount in order to be able to quantify and be able to set goals. Like the goal of how much of Earth can be protected or should be protected. But before I begin talking about goals, I want to talk a little bit more about why. Why are ecosystems with low human influence important? Aren't they just blank spaces on a map? How do they benefit us? Well, before I even mention how kind of places like this could benefit us, I do want to say that I believe that wild places, wild species, and wild places have kind of an intrinsic value and right to exist on their own, separate from us. But in many cases, right, we want to quantify these types of things and put them into a dollar value so we can better, perhaps better protect them in some cases. So nature provides services that we call ecosystem services to humanity that help sustain our economies, our livelihoods, and our health. Economists have calculated that these services provide tens of trillions of dollars annually to our global economy. Now, those estimates tend to vary pretty substantially, but they're generally larger than the size of the global gross national product. And so some of these services tend to break down into 4 different categories. Provisioning services, like the production of timber, the production of soil that underlies the production of food and fiber. Regulatory services, like things that filter pollutants from air and water, that help regulate climate, that recycle material and wastes. Now, you can see in the bar graph there these kind of values, right? These are the replacement values, the replacement costs. So this is basically how much humans would have to pay to create plants or some, to do these services that are currently being done for free for us by nature, right? So these are these replacement costs. So how much would it cost to create a plant that would filter out that does additional water filtration for us, for instance? And we have supporting services and cultural services as well. Well, ecosystem services are not entirely eliminated in human impacted systems. They are degraded, right? You go to a city park, you still see, there's still habitat there. There's still birds in the trees, squirrels running around. But the services are degraded in human impacted systems. And there's increasingly detailed research on exactly how human impacts can impact and affect various services. For instance, recent work has shown that intact ecosystems are the best at providing a buffer against the impacts of climate change, such as increasing sea levels, rising temperatures, increasing levels of aridity, and extremes in precipitation. And we saw that earlier this week here in Salisbury, North Carolina, where Catawba College is based. I think we had about a month's worth of rain in fall in 2 hours. And so intact ecosystems, areas that had minimal human impact, would be better at buffering against those kind of extremes in precipitation than other land uses. But what about species? Other work has shown that the level of human impact that a species faces is the primary driver of its extinction risk. So the more human impact that the species faces, the more likely it is to be threatened with extinction or perhaps go to extinction. Now, unfortunately, as we increasingly recognize the importance of these wild natural systems, their erosion continues. As human populations and economies have expanded, so too has humanity's influence on the natural environment. Humanity now consumes 1/4 of net primary productivity, that is photosynthesis on the planet. So we consume 1/4 of all the photosynthesis on the planet that occurs, we kind of capture and use for our own benefit. Right. Human impact has spread across the planet. Roughly 20% of the land is classified as urban or as cropland. Indeed, every part of the world has been impacted by humans in some form or fashion, right? Through air or water pollution, degradation of the ozone layer, and thereby kind of increased solar radiation, through plastics and microplastics. Microplastics were found at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, or in the Marianas Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, right? So human impacts are pervasive. Protected areas, like parks and national parks, these are the cornerstone of biodiversity conservation efforts, of protection of efforts to protect our natural world. They can take, protected areas can take many different forms. from complete exclusion zones where humans are not allowed at all, to places like indigenous peoples' lands where people are meant to live. So primarily, we think of indigenous peoples' lands in the Amazon rainforest, for instance. They could be national parks that are primarily used for recreation, to multiple use areas where there is some low level of natural resource extraction. So protected areas can kind of run that full spectrum of types of protection. One of the most familiar forms of protection for us, at least, is the national park. And national parks may have been dubbed America's best idea, and started with Yellowstone in 1872. But protected areas have been around basically since humans kind of formed societies, been around for millennia. The earliest versions of protected areas were holy or religious sites that limited human access or the collection of natural resources at different times of year for various purposes. As protected areas have become understood to have substantial benefit in reducing threats to species and areas and protecting threatened ecosystems, and concurrently as the destruction of the natural environment has continued, protected areas and this idea has become popular and spread across the world. Within the last few decades, there have been, the increase in protected areas has been quite rapid, and it's expanded to include marine protected areas as well. So note the y-axis here in the graph, that this is area. And so you'll notice that the total amount of marine protected areas has actually surpassed the total amount of land that's in protection now. But it's still a relatively smaller percentage of the marine environment because there's more ocean than there is land. So here's a map, the spatial distribution of the world's protected areas, both on land and on Earth. We're currently at about 15% of protection of land, and 7 or 8% of the marine environment is protected. Its protected areas have increased and expanded across the globe. One of the drivers of this expansion has been policy driven kind of through the United Nations and through this Convention on the Biological Diversity, or CBD, another form of CBD. Right. In 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity was signed by 196 countries. All 196 UN member states have signed and ratified this, except for, drum roll, the United States, right? The only states is the only one who has not done that. We've signed it, but not ratified it. So this is a binding international treaty for all those who ratify it, meaning that the signatories are meant to uphold their obligations that are spelled out in the treaty. Now, importantly, you're meant to uphold those obligations, but there's no punitive measure for not meeting those obligations. So there are no fines assessed or anything like that that happens if you don't meet those obligations. Now, the CBD includes targets for the establishment of protected areas. It sets these goals at these global meetings, and then the countries are supposed to kind of follow suit. Now, in 2010, it said there is a goal to protect 17% of the terrestrial surface and 10% of the marine surface by 2020. So we're just about there. The CBD holds these regular meetings, or called conferences of the parties, about every decade. And these conferences of the parties are really basically government representatives. Right? The last major one was in 2010. The next one was supposed to be this year, 2020, but it's been postponed. At this meeting, parties were supposed to set new targets and new goals for how much of the world should be protected. Over the past few years, governments and researchers have been holding meetings and NGOs doing advocacy to try to help discuss what these new targets should look like. How much of the Earth should be protected? The crazy, audacious targets that were being discussed was 30% of the planet by 2030, 30 by 30, and protecting 50% of the planet by 2050. So half of Earth, right? These targets are being led by several organizations, such as the Half Earth Project, led by E.O. Wilson, Nature Needs Half, the Global Deal for Nature, and Campaign for Nature. So remember, kind of take a step back and two things here, right? Currently, the world's only at about 15%. And so even reaching 30% would require a doubling of the protected area extent. And doing that in the next decade is pretty ambitious, pretty crazy. And protecting half of the planet is really a moonshot. But the idea is if you reach that target, theoretically, you don't have to do much more, right? We'll have protected the Earth, we'll have protected the species that are within it, we'll have protected that, we'll have kind of had a positive impact on climate change. And so all of those things will have been wrapped into kind of that level of protection. Now, the second thing to remember is that the level of protection varies, right? It's not saying that 30% of the planet has to be wilderness areas or exclusion zones where people where people cannot visit, right? The levels of protection can vary, just like I talked about earlier, where in some cases, people like indigenous peoples' lands, there may even be people living and residing completely within these areas. Okay, so if this is the first time you're hearing this, this may sound pretty crazy and pretty unbelievable. But land and water protection, land and water protection is being integrated into things like saving biodiversity and preventing the sixth mass extinction, and also being tied into addressing climate change. We can't really address climate change without addressing land as well. House Democrats and Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate for the president, have both unveiled climate and energy plans that include aiming to protect 30% of the United States by 2030. And there's some momentum towards this, even within the United States. So the Great American Outdoors Act, which was recently passed with large bipartisan support and signed into law, provides funding for our national parks, but it also fully funds, to the tune of about $1 billion a year, I think, the Land and Water Conservation Trust Fund to go out and protect additional lands. In addition, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act has passed the House, and that has hundreds of millions of dollars as well for establishing wildlife corridors. So there is some potential movement towards this type of thing, even within the United States. And certainly there is more momentum for this type of this thing, and recognition of the dangers of climate change kind of in other countries globally. But this kind of begs the question, is there even 50% of the planet left to protect? Is there 50% of the planet not primarily used by humans, that we can protect? We don't want to be, demolishing cities here and letting croplands go fallow. Is there 50% that we can save? So that was one of the primary driving questions here in our research. Now, initial attempts at mapping global human influence started in the 1980s with a focus on identifying wilderness areas, or those areas that were really kind of untouched, unimpacted by people. And these first maps were revolutionary, but were pretty crude, as you might be able to imagine, due to both data and computing limitations. Those initial attempts were often hand-drawn, relying on coarse data or old data sets. Now, over time, the maps have become increasingly better, thanks to satellites and increased computing power. And today, there are a number of recent global maps documenting different level human impacts that we can choose from. But how do we choose? How do we know which one to use? How is one map better than another? What's more relevant for me? And how much agreement or variation is there between these these various maps, both from a methodological standpoint and spatially? So in this work, we compared the four most recent global maps of human influence: Anthromes, human footprint, global human modification, and low impact areas. And I'll talk about each one of these in turn. All right, so the first thing that we did was we looked at, we compared methodology between these four data sets. So each one had slightly unique goals and slightly different goals, but they all kind of were these attempts at mapping human influence across the planet. There was different levels of resolution. They had different data sets that came from different years. There was different data set. You can see the Venn diagram there comparing some of the input data sets that each of these products used in creating that overall data, that overall map of human impact. Not only were there different input data sets, but they are aggregated or combined in different ways as well. Okay, so initially we looked at kind of these methodological differences, but then we also wanted to look at them spatially. So here you'll kind of see each one gets a full page spread here. So the Wildlife Conservation Society has put out the Human Footprint Index. This is an ordinal scale ranking from 0 to 50, ranking of kind of the lowest or the least impact to the area of 0 to the areas of 50 where there's the most human impact, the highest levels of human footprint. Another map that we looked at was Anthromes. This is a pretty different approach. This is a categorical map. This was a really important conceptual step in mapping human influence in that Earl Ellis, a researcher from University of Maryland, Baltimore, kind of integrated human systems in with natural systems or ecosystems or biomes. So he's integrating urban areas or cropland areas with the biomes or ecosystems that they were residing within. So it wasn't just that it was cropland that was within a matrix of other grasslands, or a cropland that was within a matrix of tropical rainforest, for instance, things like that. Most recently, there are kind of two global maps that were just put out in the last year or so. This one, Global Human Modification, was put out by the Nature Conservancy. It's a continuous measure of human impact, of human modification on the planet, ranging from 0 to 1. And then finally, also part of my postdoctoral work with National Geographic, we put out another categorical map called low impact areas or low human impact areas. Areas in gray are the areas that were kind of impacted by people. And the areas that are colored there are these low human impact areas, and they're color coded according to the biome that they're in. And so this is a map that identifies landscapes with low human densities and impacts, and areas that are not primarily managed for human needs. Okay, so those are these 4 data sets. Now, importantly, each of those data sets had kind of internal or inherent thresholds at which they kind of divided themselves. And there was kind of this lower division, this lowest kind of quartile roughly, that said these are areas that are basically wilderness areas, have very low human influence. And then there was another threshold that said these are areas where there's relatively little human influence. And then there's kind of the rest of land that was, these are areas impacted by people. Cows graze on it heavily. Cities are here, croplands, that type of thing. So we compared each of these different products, these different data sets, and that kind of numerical value that they had. And we found that there was pretty remarkable consistency. They almost all found that roughly a quarter of the planet was in this kind of wilderness area, or designation in a sense. And then roughly another quarter was in this had relatively low human influence. So a little bit more than the wilderness area, but not as much as the rest of that 50% that was croplands and urban areas and things like that. But then we also wanted to compare these things spatially, right? So we overlaid each of these data sets on top of each other and drilled down through all 4 of the data sets to say, you know, this particular cell, did all 4 data sets agree that it had low human impact, or was there variation in that, in those results? So that's what you're seeing here in this map. The classification agreement, full stands for these dark green areas, means that all 4 data sets agreed that this was an area that had low human influence or low human impact. The area in purple that's called none here, it's kind of a poor name. It also means that there was complete agreement in the data sets, but they all agreed kind of the reverse of the dark green. They all agreed that these were areas that were impacted by people, okay? So we had the dark green, full agreement, all 4 data sets agree. These are areas not impacted by people or that had relatively low human influences. And then the purple was areas that had all agreed there was human influence there. And then there are those gradations, the places where the data sets did not agree. Okay, so spatially then, how did this area fall out? Well, we found the majority of the agreement of where these areas of low human influence were in cold areas, like the boreal forest or the tundra, places not terribly conducive to, permanent human occupation, large cities, agriculture, things like that. They're also found in montane areas, montane grasslands like the Tibetan Plateau. And then primarily they're also found in areas that were deserts, dry areas. So like the Saharan Desert, the Australian outback, or the American Southwest. So a substantial portion of these, these kind of low human influence areas were actually in these areas that were either high in elevation, that were cold, or they're dry. Right? There was relatively little areas that were in temperate areas or tropical areas. Thankfully, there was still some, right? So I've highlighted a few here, tropical rainforest areas that where all 4 maps agreed that there was still low human influence. So that's a relatively good thing. All right, now I know this group is focused on North Carolina. So this is the same color scheme, same categorization as before. And you can see this category of full at the top, right? It means that all 4 data sets agreed this was an area that had low human influence. So those are the dark green areas. Roughly 35% of the world was in that category of low human influence. Now, when you look at just the United States, that percentage is lower. Relatively less areas of low human influence in the US relative to the overall world. And then if you look at just within the lower 48, right, that number drops a fair bit, right? A lot of our area of wilderness areas are in Alaska, right? And when you look at just North Carolina, only 2% of North Carolina was in this kind of, did all 4 data sets agree, was in this low human influence landscape. So areas in the Appalachian Mountains and kind of scattered along the coast. Okay, so our conservation takeaways here. The good news, relatively speaking, roughly 50% of the planet has relatively low human influence. There are opportunities for placement of protected areas to retain the last intact ecosystems on the planet. And I think we can and should aim high. We can achieve audacious goals like half Earth if we choose to, if we set about doing that. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions, and thank you so much for listening and for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation. Is there anybody out there that has a question? You can just go ahead and unmute yourself. Is there anybody? What we are running at our time here, so perhaps everybody's just getting ready to go somewhere else. But thank you very much, Dr. Jacobson, for bringing us your presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
It was very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Neer.
Thank you. We really enjoyed.
Great. Yeah, I've got a 4-year-old,
Thank you.
5-year-old. Looks like
Thank
about
you.
that age. Cool.
Oh yeah, he's been very curious.
Thanks for listening in.
Thanks.
Just a whole lot of thank yous in the chat box for you.
Oh, good, good. Yeah, I know this is maybe a little bit out of the wheelhouse of this group, but I hope there is something of interest here. Well, I didn't account for the entirety of kind of the introduction and the all that. So my 25 minutes plus that little bit, we're right up against time. That's too bad.
There's somebody wanting to know if your contact information is available.
Yeah, great point. Let's see, was it at the beginning? Well, it's certainly in, oh no, it's not there. Can you still see my screen?
No, your screen is gone.
Okay. Oops. All right.
Well,
Well,
we can include it in the, if you want to put it in the chat window, that will be available to people that look for it.
okay. And then it should be in the bio, speaker bios, I imagine. Okay, here we are. Chat.
There we go.
Um,
So anybody looking to contact Dr. Jacobson, his email is in the chat box.
yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, you're good.
Hi from South. Oh, Wendy. Wendy was here. I know Wendy Spry. Great. She works for our utilities.
Okay.
Our utility. Cool. Well, it doesn't appear to be any additional questions.
I don't think so.
And I see the poll is closed, so it looks like most interesting to folks. That's good. Not too heavy on the methodology here.
Leanne is asking if there's a repository somewhere of conservation areas.
Yeah.
I'm guessing she's asking about data for.
I think it's .NET. So that's the global one. Let me see. Protect it. Yeah, it's .NET. And then for the US, it's the US. Let me just try. Yeah, and then here it is. It's done through the US. So the official protected areas here are from, for the US are, I can't type, paste. Okay, it's not letting me paste in here for some reason. So I'm gonna type it in. USGS pad viewer. So this is a protected area database run by the USGS. And so that includes, the other levels of protection would include like conservation easements that are primarily run by land trusts. And whether or not that type of information gets pulled in here varies, as well as like county level protection. Like if there's a county park, that does not always get put in here. So these are primarily like state protection, state parks and things like that. And then federal lands that under kind of various forms of protection or different forms of management. You can kind of argue about whether or not like US Forest Service land or Bureau of Land Management land it should be called protected, for instance. But anyway, that type of stuff and those types of nuances are available in that USGS protected area data set. Oh, cool. Oh, cool. Thank you, Jessica. That's great to hear from you. So yeah, I bet you had it with Dr. J. Bolin. It'd be fun to hear. It'd be fun to hear from you. Please reach out and let me know where you're at. I'd love to be able to put graduates with current students with graduates and alumni of the college, particularly those who are working in the sector. So please reach out if you can, Jessica. Well, it's nice to see it trickling in a little bit still here, so that's good. All right. Are there any more questions? We still have 18 participants.
Yeah.
But wondering if they're making it to the next presentation or not. Anyway.
Yeah, again, for anybody who got in late or anything, these sessions are being recorded and will be available online after the conference is over. If you want to go rewatch it or check out bits that you missed.
Cool. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think I may head out.
Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Jacobson.
Thank you. Yeah.
It was nice to meet you.
It was nice to meet you too. And I'll put a student in touch with you.
Yes, I look forward to it.
Women in GIS. That sounds that's good. Yeah, I'm glad to kind of make your acquaintance and be here with NCAUG. So hopefully I'll be more a regular attender in the future.
We'll look forward to seeing you again.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.